Now to Bucks County, where officials say they've solved the decades-old cold case murder of a young girl.
Yeah, today officials detailing their thorough investigation that ultimately led them to the suspect after 63 years. 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty was found murdered at St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church in Bristol in October of 1960.
Carol Ann Dougherty was 9 years old, a fifth grader at the parish school attached to St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church in Bristol Borough, Pennsylvania. She loved mystery novels, the kind she could finish in an afternoon and bring straight back to the library for more. She had a habit her whole family knew well. Whenever she passed St. Mark's, she stepped inside to say a quick prayer, whether she was on her way to the library, the store, or a friend's house. On the afternoon of October 22, 1962, she left home on her bicycle to meet two friends at the Bristol Borough Free Library. She stopped for a Coke and penny candy at a shop on Farragut Avenue, then rode down Lincoln Avenue toward the church. She never reached the library. Her friends waited outside St. Mark's, and she never came out to meet them. When she didn't come home for dinner, her parents, Frank and Dorothy, began searching, driving the route she always took. Around 6 that evening, Dorothy spotted Carol Ann's bicycle parked outside the church. Frank went in alone. What he found inside would haunt Bristol Borough for the next 63 years. And what was left behind at the scene, evidence no one could yet explain, would end up pointing at a killer decades before anyone could prove it. Carol Ann had been raped and strangled with a ligature. Investigators found torn hair clutched in her hand, evidence of a struggle she had fought hard to survive. A few Lucky Strike cigarette butts were also left at the scene, a detail no one could connect to anyone yet. Bristol Police Chief Vincent Farragalli led the investigation personally from the first hour, and it never left him. He kept a photograph of Carol Ann on his desk for the next 17 years and never once discussed the case with his own 3 daughters. Whatever failure he felt about never solving it, he carried alone for the rest of his career. Within weeks, detectives narrowed their focus to 4 men connected to the area. The first was a local handyman with a low IQ, known around town for his troubled reputation. After hours of interrogation, he confessed. Within 24 hours, he recanted, and Farragalli determined the confession had been coerced. He was cleared. The second was a 19-year-old whose own parents had found Carol Ann's name written in his notebook. Detectives investigated him and cleared him by his alibi. The third was a parish priest at St. Mark's, whose account of his own whereabouts that day turned out to be a lie, though it had nothing to do with Carol Ann's murder at all. He passed a polygraph and was eliminated. 3 suspects, 3 different reasons for suspicion, and none of them the man responsible. Investigators would later call this convergence a perfect storm, because the noise from 3 unrelated dead ends gave real cover to a 4th man nobody had looked at hard enough yet, a man living just down the same street Carol Ann had ridden her bicycle down that afternoon. 2 months after the murder, a neighbor called police to report a man acting strangely, someone seen cutting through a yard near the church the day Carol Ann died. Other witnesses recalled a man with a scar on his face nearby that afternoon, someone who looked, as one of them put it, like he'd just done something terrible. He worked at a local tool factory and lived a block and a half from St. Mark's, on Lincoln Avenue. In January 1963, detectives brought him in. He claimed he'd been at work the day of the murder. His time cards told a different story. He hadn't worked in 3 days, including October 22nd. He was lying, and detectives knew it. They took a hair sample from him and put him on a polygraph. He failed it. Within weeks, he was gone, first to Florida, then Texas, before finally settling 1,000 miles away in Houma, Louisiana. His name was William Schrader, and for the next 6 decades, it would sit in a case file that could never quite close around him. Over the following years, investigators collected hair samples from 176 men connected to the case. 141 were tested using the microscopic comparison methods available at the time. Every single man was eliminated, except Schrader. His sample showed what analysts called significant similarities to the hairs pulled from Carol Ann's hand. It wasn't proof. It was elimination of everyone else, and pointing at one man is not the same as convicting him. If a case like this has you hooked, hit subscribe right now, because Cairo True Crime Breakdown covers stories exactly like this one every week, and this one is about to take you somewhere you won't expect. Schrader built a new life far from Bristol, but the violence that had marked him as a suspect never actually stopped, it just moved south with him. In 1970, during a domestic dispute with his wife in Houma, he threatened to burn their house down if she was still inside when he returned. That night, a 12-year-old girl the family was fostering, Catherine Smith, was staying over. Schrader set the fire. Catherine died. His own stepdaughter, also in the house, survived with permanent brain damage. Investigators at the time couldn't determine the cause of the blaze, and the case sat unresolved for 15 years. It wasn't until 1985 that Louisiana authorities revisited the investigation, prompted by a witness who had stayed silent since the night it happened, Catherine's older sister Judy, who had heard Schrader threaten the fire firsthand but never told anyone outside her family. A jury convicted Schrader of manslaughter in 1986. He was sentenced to 21 years at hard labor, the maximum penalty for the charge, not for murder, but for the lesser crime the evidence could prove. He had killed a second child in a second state, and once again, the law could only reach part of the truth. The newspapers hadn't forgotten Bristol, either. In 1992, a reporter named J.D. Mullane began digging through the 30-year-old case file for an anniversary series, and what he found pulled Carol Ann's murder back into public view for the first time in decades. Then Bucks County District Attorney Alan Rubenstein read it, and so did the Pennsylvania State Police. They ran the hair comparison again in 1993. The result held. Schrader was still the one sample no one could rule out. In 1994, Bucks County extradited him from Louisiana, where he was already serving his sentence for the fire. A grand jury convened, and both Schrader and the priest who had once been a suspect were called to testify. What happened in that room would decide whether Carol Ann's case ever saw justice, or whether the man on Lincoln Avenue would walk free one more time. Both men appeared before the grand jury, though only one of them spoke. Father Sabadish testified, as did Frank Dougherty, Carol Ann's father, who sat before the jury and told them everything he knew, the closest the system would ever bring him to his daughter's killer. Schrader invoked his Fifth Amendment right and said nothing at all. Both men passed polygraph tests. Neither was indicted. Schrader was sent back to Louisiana to finish his sentence, and Frank and Dorothy Dougherty would both die years later without ever hearing his name legally confirmed as the man who killed their daughter. This is where the case seemed to end for good. If it feels unfinished to you too, that's exactly the point. Stay with this one, because what happens next took another 13 years to even begin. Schrader served out his sentence at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. The 1994 trip to Pennsylvania had been a brief interruption in an otherwise unremarkable prison term. He never faced a courtroom again for either child he had killed. In July 2002, he died there of a heart attack, 62 years old, having caused 2 deaths in 2 states and never once standing trial as a murderer for either one. With his death, the case appeared permanently closed in the only way that mattered. There was no one left to charge, and no confession on record that any court had ever heard. Carol Ann's file remained open in name only, a piece of unfinished business with no one left alive who could finish it. Or so everyone believed. In 2007, 5 years after Schrader's death, a man walked into a parole office in Houma, Louisiana, and asked to speak to the officer on duty. His name was Robert LeBlanc, Schrader's stepson. He told the officer that his stepfather had confessed to him before he died, to killing a little girl inside a church in Pennsylvania. He said Schrader had called it the perfect murder. The officer, William Null, wrote it down and mailed the letter to Bucks County. It arrived at the desk of a detective working the case. And then, for reasons that were never fully explained, nothing happened. That detective eventually retired, and the letter went with him, filed away, unopened by anyone who might have understood what it meant. A confession that could have answered a 60-year-old question sat forgotten in a drawer while Carol Ann's only surviving sibling kept waiting for a call that never came. If that sits as heavy with you as it does with us, hit that like button right now, because someone eventually did open that drawer, and what they found next changed everything. In the early 2020s, Bucks County Detective Lieutenant Timothy Perkins reopened the Dougherty case completely, starting from the very first page. Working alongside Pennsylvania State Police troopers Jordan Rhodes, Christopher Cleveland, and David Bear, he began rereading 6 decades of reports, interviews, and evidence logs. Somewhere in the files of a retired detective, he found the letter from 2007. He pulled it into the active case. Perkins sent the original hair samples out for testing at a lab specializing in degraded forensic material, a long shot everyone involved acknowledged going in. 60 years in evidence storage, including a stretch in an unheated attic through Pennsylvania winters, had done what none of the original investigators could have prevented. The lab couldn't extract a usable DNA profile. The one piece of physical evidence that had pointed at Schrader for decades was now, finally, unusable. With the science exhausted, Perkins turned to the one lead the case had never fully followed. He went to Louisiana to find Robert LeBlanc himself. In November 2024, Perkins and the state troopers sat down with LeBlanc in person. Older now, he told the story again from the beginning, and this time, investigators listened for details that had never been made public, the exact location of Carol Ann's bicycle, Schrader having been seen outside the church, facts LeBlanc could only have known if his stepfather had truly confessed to him. Investigators found his account highly credible precisely because it matched evidence no news report had ever printed. A forensic psychologist, Dr. Veronique Vollier, later explained to the grand jury why a man like Schrader would eventually need to confess at all, why pride in getting away with something can, over enough time, outweigh the instinct to stay silent. In Schrader's case, it took more than 40 years, but he told someone twice. On October 29, 2025, 63 years and 1 day after Carol Ann was killed, Bucks County District Attorney Jennifer Scorn stood before reporters in Doylestown and announced that a grand jury had formally identified William Schrader as her killer. The 53-page report, approved by President Judge Raymond Maheu, drew on everything the case had gathered across 6 decades, the hair evidence that eliminated every other man, the Lucky Strike cigarettes matching his known brand, the lies he told in 1963, his silence before the 1994 grand jury, and finally, the confession he could not keep to himself before he died. The grand jury approved charges of murder, rape, robbery, theft, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. There was no one left to arrest. The case closed under what the law calls an exception, death of the offender. Kay, the toddler who once sat in a car 63 years earlier and heard her father's voice break, stood at that podium as an adult and said her family lived without answers for so long that the uncertainty became part of who they were, a shadow touching every day of their lives. She was the only one of the 4 Doughertys who lived to hear her sister's killer finally named. Before you go, subscribe to Cairo True Crime Breakdown so cases like this one find you the moment we release them. Carol Ann Dougherty was 9 years old. She loved mystery books, and no matter where she was headed that day, she always stopped to pray first. What finally closed her case wasn't a courtroom, or a lab, or 60 years of forensic testing. It was a letter that sat unread for 13 years, and a man who, in the end, couldn't carry his own secret to the grave. What stayed with you the longest, the letter no one read, or the confession that finally broke the silence? Tell us in the comments below. We go beyond the surface, always.